Okay.
Uh,
Yeah. I'll welcome the participants first, Jamie.
sure.
Oke. Selamat malam teman-teman. Terima kasih banget nih jam 10 malam kalian masih luangin waktu untuk dengerin malam-malam ngomongin filsafat gitu ya. Ngomongin filsafat agama, Epistemologi Reformed gitu ya, dan hal-hal yang membingungkan lainnya gitu. Tapi sangat appreciate kalian yang ambil waktu untuk malam-malam ngomongin soal filsafat ini. Nah, kita udah kedatangan Jamie Turner. Saat ini dia udah menyelesaikan S2-nya di Haldun University, itu di Turki, dan sekarang sedang ambil S3-nya nanti di Birmingham University. Nah, itu University of Birmingham, itu salah satu university yang sangat baik juga untuk konteks filsafat agama. Jadi dia bakal di-advise sama Yuji Nagasawa. Kami pernah undang juga sekolah gitu. Jadi kita beruntung banget kita bisa kedatangan sama Jamie Turner untuk ngomongin soal Epistemologi Reformed. So Jamie, we're really grateful for your willingness to come here. Yeah, it will be great to talk about reform epistemology in Islam, considering I could say Indonesia is one of the biggest country who one of the country which has Islam as one of the biggest religions in the whole world, I think.
Yeah, I think actually Indonesia has the majority of Muslims, if you like, are Indonesian, if you had to section it off. Yeah, but thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to come and talk with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. So Jamie, could you share a bit about what are you doing right now?
Yeah, of course I can. So I heard, although I couldn't understand what you were saying exactly, but I heard that you mentioned that I'm currently at Ibn Haldun University. So that's true. So I'm a research fellow at Ibn Haldun University in philosophy. And as you mentioned, I'll be doing my PhD, God willing, in September at the University of Birmingham. So my interest, I mean, for many years now, ever since I went to university, has been in the philosophy of religion, really. Obviously, I'm Muslim, so I have a tendency to be interested in questions to do with Islam specifically. And also because, a lot of the literature in philosophy of religion over the past several decades has been dominated by Christian philosophers and scholars who have done a remarkable job. But I think it's time, following maybe Yuji Nagasawa, to enter into the phase of global philosophy of religion. And I'd like to be, perhaps one of those who can contribute from an Islamic perspective to some extent, I hope.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Please let me translate it. Jadi teman-teman, sesuai yang tadi saya udah jelasin, cuma tadi ada tambahan lagi dari Jamie Turner bahwa dia sebagai seorang Islam punya ketertarikan juga untuk ngomongin filsafat di dalam konteks Islam, mengingat dalam beberapa dekade terakhir ini filsafat agama itu isinya orang-orang Kristen lah, bisa kami bilang. Nah, Jamie dengan demikian mau berkontribusi ya untuk untuk mengglobalisasikan filsafat agama. Jadi nggak cuma Barat gitu ya, Christian perspectives, tapi juga also Islamic philosophy. So Jamie, thank you so much. So I'll give you the first questions, Jamie, on today's interview. Before we discuss our topics today about reform epistemology and Islam, I want to ask you a broader questions, and we always ask these questions to every interviewer we had here. So I wanna know that what is philosophy for you, and how could you first indulge in philosophy? And maybe the second, why academic philosophy? Maybe the first questions.
Yeah. So the first question is, I suppose, what does philosophy mean to me? I think philosophy is obviously an interesting discipline. I mean, it tackles the deepest fundamental questions of life. I remember as a young child thinking to myself, well, why am I here? How did I get here? Where am I going? What am I doing here essentially? And what are my purposes and goals in this life? And so, I think I was always an inquisitive sort of person from that perspective. And so philosophy is a discipline that attracts people who often wrestle with these sorts of questions in their minds. So that got me, you could say, into philosophy without really knowing it, perhaps from a young age. But philosophy now, I mean, for me as an academic discipline, is a way to think about these questions in more sophisticated terms. For instance, in the philosophy of religion, we think about questions concerning the existence of God, the nature of revelation, maybe the problem of evil and suffering in the world. And intuitively, as human beings, we often have answers to these questions. For instance, it might just seem to us from a young age that God exists, and that's fine. But perhaps for some of us, we want to tie our beliefs closely to the dictates of reason. We want to make sure that we're thinking about things in the right way. And so philosophy opens up that opportunity to think more, perhaps deeply sophisticatedly, if I can use that term, about some of these questions. So I think that's what philosophy is for me. Yeah, I suppose.
So, why at the first time you decide to take philosophy in your bachelor degree, and why at the end now you're trying to pursue your PhD in philosophy? Yeah, you try to indulge in academic philosophy. Why? Could you share a bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was thinking about going to university, I thought, what should I do? What should I do at university? Perhaps I should just do a degree that gets me a good job in the end. Maybe I'll become an accountant or a lawyer or an engineer or something like that. It's a bit risky to take philosophy at university, isn't it? But then I thought to myself, no, I want to do something that I will enjoy at the end of the day. I don't want to work 9 to 5 at some business that I feel totally detached from. So I thought, well, questions in the philosophy of religion are what I think about all the time. I spend my time reading, watching lectures on these sorts of things, and they just grip me. These questions, these issues just grip my mind, and I'm almost obsessed with thinking about them. So I wanted to do this, at a professional level and spend my time learning and teaching others about these issues, really. And so that's why I want to pursue it in academia, to pursue research in further depth, and to hopefully teach and share some of these ideas with others who can benefit from them.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm agree. It's really risky to take philosophy, and moreover, if you take it in Indonesia, I think it really risky. Please let me translate it, Jamie. Jadi teman-teman, saya nanya gitu ya, kenapa sih? Apa itu filsafat buat Jamie, dan kenapa dia akhirnya memutuskan untuk ambil filsafat di dia? Nah, pertama, sebenarnya pada dasarnya kita semua kan adalah filsuf. Ya, sejak dari anak-anak kita bertanya, kita itu asal dari mana, kan? Apa itu Tuhan, dan semacam. Jadi dari awal memang udah ada ketertarikan di sana lah. Jadi udah berfilsafat tanpa mengetahui apa itu filsafat, karena begitu. Nah, by the time gitu ya, si Jamie mulai berpikir untuk ngambil filsafat. Kenapa? Karena tadinya dia pikir bahaya ya ambil filsafat, iyalah gitu kan. Mungkin tingkat penganggurannya besar juga kali ya kalau ambil filsafat gitu. Nah, dia akhirnya decide untuk ambil filsafat karena dia mau menikmati atau mau ambil jurusan yang memang buat dia nikmat. Ya, salah satunya dengan riset, memang dia tertarik di sana. Nah, makanya sekarang akhirnya dia ambil PhD juga di Birmingham. Nah, teman-teman, anyway, kalau ada pertanyaan, itu langsung aja chat di bawah ya. Jadi kita lanjut nih ke pertanyaan selanjutnya. Kenapa Epistemology of Religious Belief, dan juga kenapa filsafat agama? Kenapa itu membuat Jamie tertarik? So, Jamie, I'll go to the second questions. Your research interest is in philosophy of religion, and especially epistemology of religious belief. Could you share a bit about those topics, and why, and what are they?
Yeah, I'll try my best. So yeah, I mean, philosophy. How would you define philosophy first of all? And then perhaps that can help us to think about certain branches of philosophy, like philosophy of religion. I saw that you had Kelly James Clark on, I think, the previous episode. I met Kelly here in Istanbul a couple of times, and he's a good friend of mine, and I benefited from his work. But I noticed that he, in his interview with you, he referred to Alvin Plantinga's definition of philosophy, which was something like philosophy is thinking really hard about something. Yeah, and I think if we take that as some kind of loose definition, and then we try to branch off into religion, we might have the philosophy of religion. So philosophy of religion would be thinking really hard about religious questions to do with religion. And what is religion about? Religion is about, God, theism. The religion is about revelation and scripture, and these sorts of issues. So that's roughly what we might think philosophy of religion has to do with. Now, the epistemology of religious belief, or religious epistemology, is a particular branch of within philosophy of religion. It's also a particular branch within epistemology as well. So epistemology is roughly the study of knowledge and justification, what conditions of belief might need for it to be sufficient for knowledge or something like that. And so religious epistemology is concerned with questions like about our religious beliefs, like belief in God, or belief in the Quran, or the Bible, or Jesus as being the Son of God, or a prophet, or whatever it might be. And so we have these different beliefs as religious folk. And then we might want to think about how those beliefs relate to what philosophers sometimes call positive epistemic status. Like, is that belief just merely a belief? Is it a guess? Is it rational to believe that? Can we be justified in believing? Can we know these kind of things? And that's really important to me. I want to be a rational believer, of course. So I'm interested in what it takes to be one of those, I suppose. Yeah, so that's it, I suppose.
Yeah, I got it. So I think maybe to understand it in a simple way, how do we know about our religious belief? How do we know what we know about religious belief is really knowledge? Am I right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And some topics like you said that the Quran, the Bible, etc. Please let me translate it, Jamie.
Yes. Please.
Jadi teman-teman, topik pembahasan daripada Jamie itu kan filsafat agama dan epistemologi kepercayaan beragama. Nah, filsafat agama itu adalah, kalau sederhana ini kata Alvin Plantinga, filsafat itu adalah soal thinking hard about something, atau berpikir keras mengenai sesuatu. Nah, filsafat agama berarti adalah berpikir keras mengenai agama gitu ya, tentang Al-Quran, tadi mungkin ada Jamie, tentang Alkitab dan sebagainya. Nah, kalau ngomongin soal epistemologi kepercayaan beragama, artinya ini adalah bicara soal epistemologi dalam konteks agama. Apa itu epistemologi? Simpelnya, epistemologi adalah sebuah usaha untuk memahami epistemologi itu untuk mencoba mengetahui bahwa apakah yang sungguh-sungguh kita ketahui itu benar-benar dapat disebut sebagai pengetahuan, ya, dan apakah hal-hal yang kita percaya itu dapat disebut sebagai rasional, tapi dalam konteks agama, ya, misalnya dari mana kita bisa mengatakan bahwa Al-Quran itu wahyu Allah, atau apakah Yesus itu anak Allah atau nabi, itu dan semacamnya. Jadi gimana cara mastiin yang kita percaya soal agama itu memang benar-benar rasional. Nah, kurang lebih begitu. Kalau ada pertanyaan, silakan langsung chat. Kita lanjut ke pertanyaan selanjutnya terkait reform epistemologi atau epistemologi reform. Ya, oke. So Jamie, let's go to the discuss topics today about your writings on Islamic account of reform epistemology. Before we talk the Islamic account, please share to us about your view on reform epistemology. What is reform epistemology?
Yeah. What is reformed epistemology? Okay, so reformed epistemology is a thesis or an idea that cropped up in the later part of the 20th century in philosophy of religion. Perhaps some of you have heard of philosophers like Alvin Plantinga. He's very famous, of course. There are also philosophers called William Alston, Nicholas Walterstorff, and these figures, some of which come out of Calvin College, like Plantinga and Walterstorff, they defended an idea which was perhaps radical at the time, which was the idea that religious belief, belief in God, and even later on in his work, Plantinga talked about Christian belief, can be rational or justified apart from argumentation. So normally when we think about our religious beliefs like the existence of God, theists who believe in God are often challenged by the atheist to give some proof or evidence or arguments to kind of back up or defend that claim. And the atheist sometimes says something like this. They'll say that belief in God is only justified if you've got good arguments for it. And there are no good arguments, therefore belief in God is not justified. Now, typically, theists have said this is not right, this argument is unsound, because they've said, actually, we do have good arguments for our belief in God. We have the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument, etc. And therefore, because we have good arguments, we're justified in our belief in God. But Reformed epistemologists say we don't need to go that route. In fact, we can be justified even if there are no good arguments whatsoever. And finally, just for now, because I know you have to translate, this idea that theistic belief can be justified apart from argumentation is sometimes paralleled with some of our other beliefs, like beliefs in other minds, or beliefs in the past or the external world, etc. It doesn't seem like we have good arguments for these things, but nonetheless we think that they're rational anyway. And so it seems possible, at least the Reformed epistemologists would say, that belief in God could be similar to those.
Yeah. I remember once Russell, when someone asked him, what would you say when you see God one day? If you see God one day, he said that not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence. I think that's what I think pictured most of the maybe the atheists around here about how to justify our belief regarding the existence or knowledge about God.
Right. Yeah, I agree. But I would also say, and maybe we can touch on this a bit later, the Reformed epistemologists might say that there doesn't have to be good arguments, but they don't necessarily say there isn't good evidence, because our strong experience of God is a form of evidence in itself.
Okay, please let me translate it, Jamie. Jadi teman-teman, epistemologi reform itu apa sih? Kan kita ngomongin epistemologi reform dalam perspektif Islam, tapi ngomong epistemologi reformnya dulu. Epistemologi reform ini suatu pendekatan epistemologis terhadap agama ya di dalam pemikiran dari beberapa filsuf yang asal dari Amerika, Alvin College secara khusus, yaitu Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Walterstorff, sama satu lagi William Alston. Nah, mereka percaya bahwa yang namanya kepercayaan mengenai Tuhan atau pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan itu nggak memerlukan bukti, singkatnya gitu. Nah, itu kan klaim yang sebenarnya bisa dibilang sangat kuat pada masanya, gitu loh. Nah, ingat kebanyakan orang-orang ateis setelah itu mengatakan bahwa idemu tentang Tuhan itu harus dijustifikasi, ya harus dibenarkan jika dan hanya jika kalau ada bukti. Nah, klaim Plantinga dan juga Walterstorff ini cukup besar gitu ya. Nah, kok bisa mereka berpikir seperti itu? Salah satunya ya itu adalah terkait dengan kita punya beberapa pengetahuan misalnya soal memori gitu ya, masa lalu dan kawan-kawannya, dunia eksternal, dan kita nggak perlu loh justifikasi atau argumen buat mereka. Jangan kita nggak mungkin kan meragukan kayaknya Jamie yang saya ajak ngobrol di sini bukan orang deh gitu ya. Jamie ini cuma robot AI gitu ya. Karena saya nggak punya argumen gitu. Nggak mungkin seperti itu kan. Nah, oleh karena itu secara singkatnya gitu ya, Epistemologi Reformed mencoba untuk melihat kepercayaan mengenai Tuhan itu juga bisa setara sama kepercayaan-kepercayaan lainnya yang memang tidak punya argumen yang kuat gitu loh. Nah, ini menarik ya. Tapi kita akan coba untuk gali lebih jauh lagi. Jamie, I wonder, yes, it's true that we have so much things, beliefs in ourselves about memory, about past, about even ourselves that doesn't have any arguments for it. But I wonder, how could a belief about God could be something that is, you don't need any argument. How could it? How could your belief in God doesn't need any justifications?
All right, so I think really what we need to be thinking about here is actually what is the nature of justification itself. The Reformed epistemologist is not saying that we don't need any justification. Rather, the Reformed epistemologist is saying that justification can come even if an argument is not there. So let's think about, our belief that, in the past, let's say our belief in the past. I think the skeptical scenario is the idea that, well, maybe, I just popped into existence 5 minutes ago with all these implanted memories in my mind, and none of them actually occurred in reality. We don't have that belief. We all ordinarily believe that the things that did happen, several years ago really did happen. Okay? We don't have a good argument for that. Could I really rely on my memory, for example, to prove that my memory is reliable? That seems a bit circular. The idea that you have an actual mind, that you're a conscious, sentient being, I can't really find that out by investigating into your brain, for instance. I can't maybe come up with a strong argument there, etc. And we have these examples. So it seems as if these beliefs that we have are justified. At least we ordinarily think that they are. But then we need to think a little bit more carefully about what justification is. Okay? It seems reasonable, for instance, to believe in the past without an argument. But it doesn't seem reasonable, for instance, to believe, let's say I had the belief that next week on Friday, I believe it's going to snow. And let's just pretend I didn't look at any weather forecast or anything. And I just had that belief. I mean, surely I need to have some evidence of that. I need to have some, good reasons to back that belief up. So it doesn't look like that belief would be justified without an argument. So what's the difference? What marks out the difference? Well, roughly, Alvin Plantinga, who, by the way, focuses on a term called warrant. Warrant is the idea of whatever is needed to make a belief knowledge. Plantinga, focusing on warrant, focuses on our cognitive faculties. So it seems as if, as human beings, we're geared up with certain faculties. We have a faculty of sight, we have a faculty of reason, etc. And the products of these faculties, when they're functioning properly, and as long as they're aimed at truth, seem as if they can give us justified true belief or warranted beliefs. So I have a faculty of sight. When I look at this laptop in front of me, I see, I see you before me. And this is a natural product of my faculty of sight functioning properly. I don't need, therefore, an argument. I don't need an argument. Okay, and the same thing happens with our memory beliefs, etc. But with my belief about the weather next week, it doesn't seem like we have the faculties to know those sorts of beliefs in a basic way without arguments. Okay, So now, turning to God, the hypothesis is that if God does exist, and it seems as if he does to me and many other theists, then it seems possible to think that God created us with a faculty like or akin to our other faculties, which when functioning properly will give us an immediate apprehension of his existence. So if we have faculties that can give us justified belief in what's in front of us or about the past or the external world, then there could be a faculty geared up for theistic belief that God has created. And for those theists that have this strong sense of God's presence, then I think that they would be justified in thinking that that's the case.
Okay, thank you. So instead of say that knowledge is justified through belief, Plantinga changed the way we think about knowledge. Knowledge is not something that justified by evidence, i.e., but by some warrant, the way our faculty, cognitive faculty functioning properly.
Yeah, that's true. Plantinga realized that there are different epistemological concepts like rationality, justification, and warrant. They refer to different things. For Plantinga, warrant is what gets us close to knowledge. So if we have enough warrant, then we will have knowledge. But some beliefs, to be warranted, don't need arguments, like the belief that I am seeing you on the screen. But other beliefs, for warrant, do need arguments. And that depends on the nature of our faculties and who we are, essentially, as human beings.
Okay, please let me translate it, Jamie. Jadi teman-teman, pertanyaannya kan, kok bisa ya pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan itu sesuatu yang nggak perlu dibuktikan, gitu, atau bisa dipercayai bahkan tanpa bukti sekalipun. Cukup panjang ya, tapi sederhananya itu adalah, jadi buat Plantinga gitu ya, yang namanya pengetahuan itu bukanlah sesuatu yang, jadi para filsuf zaman dulu tuh pahami yang namanya knowledge sebagai justified true belief atau kepercayaan yang benar yang terjustifikasi gitu ya. Nah, tapi itu konsep yang akhirnya ditinggalkan, bukan ditinggalkan sih, tapi mulai nggak terlalu mulai terlalu didekati lah ya. Tapi ada usaha untuk memahami secara berbeda. Nah, Plantinga memahami yang namanya pengetahuan itu sebagai sesuatu yang kepercayaan yang kita miliki yang terjamin gitu, atau ada satu faktor yang menyebabkan yaitu disebut sebagai pengetahuan. Nah, apa sih faktornya itu? Faktornya adalah keberfungsian yang semestinya atau proper function. Nah, jadi dengan cara kerja daripada fakultas kognitif kita, ya, dia akan membentuk suatu pengetahuan yang kita sebut dengan pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan. Jadi pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan itu diproduksi oleh fakultas kognitif kita yang berfungsi dengan semestinya. Nah, kalau memang Tuhan ada, ya, dan tadi Jamie bilang, dan bagi sebagian filsuf dan termasuk dirinya, Tuhan itu memang cenderung ada, maka ia akan menciptakan fakultas kognitif kita, ya, atau otak lah ya kasarnya, itu untuk punya fakultas yang mampu menghasilkan pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan. Gitu loh. Tapi apakah semua pengetahuan itu nggak perlu dibuktikan atau nggak perlu justifikasi? Nggak juga. Ya. Kepercayaan bahwa dalam minggu depan itu misalnya akan hujan, itu perlu justifikasi gitu ya, untuk bisa punya warrant. Ya. Oke, kita lanjut lagi nih. Ini bahas reform epistemologi secara umum. Kita akan lanjut ke soal gimana Islam memandang reform epistemologi. So, Jamie, we already talked about this reform epistemology, maybe in a general way. So, I wonder, are there any thinkers who offer an Islamic count of reform epistemology before what you write before? And what do you think about their understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there was someone who had written an account on reformed epistemology in Islam before me. He's not a Muslim. He's a Christian. He's called Eric Baldwin. And my own work on reformed epistemology in the paper, which I think you've read, came out of critiquing that account in a sense. Because it seemed to me that the way in which Baldwin, for instance, framed these accounts of Reformed epistemology within the Islamic tradition didn't really capture the intuition of Reformed epistemology that Plantinga had captured. In other words, Baldwin's model of Reformed epistemology still required that the believer engages in argumentation to some extent. And that seems to compromise the Plantingian idea. So I thought, well, that doesn't seem right to me. That doesn't seem as if it's the only way of thinking about it. In actual fact, it seems within certain branches of theology in the Islamic tradition, we can mirror the Plantingian account. And in fact, we actually have within one thinker in particular, at least, who I draw upon, someone who almost, he didn't come up with Reformed epistemology before Plantinga, but he came up with ideas which are very close to it, namely Ibn Taymiyyah, who's the thinker I focus on. So I thought that we need to offer an alternative account, one that really captures Plantingian Reformed epistemology, and that was what I attempted to do.
Okay, please let me translate it. Jadi teman-teman ya, sebelum dari sebelum Jamie udah ada nggak sih filsuf yang nulis juga nih tentang pendekatan Islam terhadap epistemologi reform? Udah ada, namanya Eric Baldwin. Tapi Eric Baldwin ini seorang Kristen. Nah anyway, tapi bukan karena dia Kristen gitu ya, makanya jadi nggak cocok. Tapi karena dia itu punya perspektif yang kalau dalam perspektif Alvin Plantinga, pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan itu sifatnya lebih intuitif. Nah, sedangkan Baldwin ini nuansanya masih menekankan peran argumentasi di dalam kepercayaan mengenai Tuhan. Nah, ini yang tidak disetujui sama Jamie. Nah, makanya si Jamie itu punya dia mengusahakan supaya apa yang ia tulis itu lebih mendekati apa yang Plantinga tuliskan, ya, nuansa intuitif. Dan salah satu pemikir yang ia gunakan adalah Ibn Taymiyah, seorang pemikir asal Timur Tengah, gitu ya, abad ke-13 sampai abad ke-14. Nah, sekarang kita penasaran, kira-kira siapa sih Ibn Taymiyah itu? So, Jamie, you mentioned about Ibn Taymiyah. You construct your Islamic account of reform epistemology through Ibn Taymiyah writings. Could you share about who is Ibn Taymiyah?
Yeah, I would like to. So Ibn Taymiyyah is a famous and often controversial Islamic thinker, a theologian and jurist, who was living around the 14th century, or he died in the 14th century in Damascus. So he's a Damascene Islamic theologian, and he's often critical of philosophy, by the way, and the Muslim philosophers like Ibn Sina, and general philosophical theological tradition in Islam, which is called the Kalam. And he thought that some of these arguments that the philosophers and theologians engaged in are not only not only wrong, I should say, but also misguided. And that, in fact, we can know God exists, apart from arguments, through a kind of a natural disposition that God had built within us when he created us, which is called fitra, the idea of a human nature or tendency to believe certain things like the existence of God, to believe in goodness, and to want to do what is good. And so he thinks, of course, that the environment that we're in may tarnish this fitra. It may corrupt it to some extent, but nonetheless, when the fitra is intact, God can be known without arguments.
I see. Okay, let me translate it. Jadi buat siapa sih Ibn Taymiyah itu? Ibn Taymiyah adalah seorang filsuf, ya, teolog juga dari Damaskus, itu di abad ke-14, gitu ya. Nah, si Ibn Taimiyah ini kritis ya terhadap pendekatan-pendekatan filosofis, ya, pendekatan filsafat agama terutama ya, yang namanya pendekatan kalam, ya, yang mendekati persoalan Tuhan secara argumentatif. Nah, buat Ibn Taimiyah kita sebenarnya bisa memahami secara lebih alamiah, gitu ya, bahwa Tuhan itu buat Taimiyah itu bukanlah sesuatu yang harus dibuktikan. Terus gimana dong? Taimiyah punya ide mengenai fitrah, gitu ya. Fitrah itu mungkin teman-teman tahu juga ya, fitrah itu kondisi naturalnya manusia, gitu ya. Jadi kecenderungan untuk berbuat baik, gitu, pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan dan segala macam. Nah, dengan fitrah ini buat Ibn Taimiyah kita bisa untuk tahu mengenai Tuhan tanpa perlu bukti. Nah, permasalahan tadi udah dibilang si Jamie juga, kadang fitrah itu bisa rusak dan menyebabkan kita berbuat jahat atau bahkan nggak punya pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan. So, Jamie, so that's about Ibn Taimiyah. How do you understand Reform epistemology in the light of Ibn Taimiyah's epistemology or understanding of religious?
Right. Yeah. So this really gets to my thesis itself in the paper. So after I critique Baldwin's account of Reformed epistemology, I move on to try to construct my own. And essentially, what I'm doing here is I'm laying down certain conditional points. That is to say, if God exists and if Islam is true, then so and so follows. This is a little bit like what Plantinga does. Plantinga, he's not trying to prove, for instance, God exists or prove Christianity in his book, Warranted Christian Belief. He's rather saying, if God exists or if Christianity is true, then so and so follows. So that's what I try to do. And also Eric Baldwin, in his paper, he divided Plantinga's account of Reformed epistemology into three basic theses, one of which was the immediacy thesis, the dependency thesis, and the design thesis. So the design thesis is the idea that God has designed our faculties to know him in a basic way. The immediacy thesis, no, rather the immediacy thesis is that God can be known immediately. The design thesis is that God is responsible for our faculties. And the other thesis, which I've just said, which I've now forgotten, which was, what did I just say? The immediacy thesis.
Basic thesis? No,
the immediacy thesis, the design thesis, and the dependency thesis, the idea that we're all dependent on God. So I was basically trying to say, okay, let me try and construct an account with these conditionals which fulfills these theses, basically. And so what I try and do is I say roughly that if God exists, then God would have created us, wanting us to know him. He created us with faculties to know him. At least according to the Islamic tradition, he has created us upon this fitrah, or this human nature, so he can be known in a basic way as long as our nature is intact. And I draw on some other cognitive faculties. So there is this relationship between the fitrah and the qalb, or the heart and mind. And when these are functioning together, God can be known in a basic way. And then you ask, well, how? Well, again, according to Islam, there is this idea that God has put many ayat, or signs, in creation. So there are situations when we look out on the horizon, or maybe when we see the mercy of a mother to its child, we have this immediate sense through these signs that God exists. And then I say, well, similarly, Islam itself could be mirrored in this same light. As to say, well, if God exists as taught according to the Quran, then God would have revealed to us not just signs in creation, but signs of a more intimate nature. The revelation of the Quran itself are made up of various signs. And so that's the conditional that I go through, and I try to explain how this is compatible with Islam and Ibn Taymiyyah's thought, particularly focusing on fitrah. Then finally, I try and match it up with these three theses, and I say, well, this account of fitrah and the account of fitrah and relationship from fitrah to ayat is compatible with the proper functionalist account of warrant that is put forward by Alvin Plantinga. So when the fitrah is functioning properly, etc., when it fulfills the conditions of warrant, it can be warranted. So yeah, I try to just mirror a Plantingian account, really, but put it in Islamic terms of reference.
I see. Oh, it's really interesting. I wonder, so should we first presuppose the existence of God itself to talk about this Reformed epistemology?
Not necessarily, no, not necessarily. But you see, when you talk about warranted, this is the issue, because for Plantinga, a warranted belief is the result of our faculties functioning properly, and those faculties being aimed at truth. Now, I cannot know if my faculties are functioning properly without relying on those same faculties, for instance. So there is that kind of basic assumption that you have to make about your faculties. So similarly, for me to be warranted in my belief in God, we need to say, well, if God exists, then he designed our faculties in such and such a way. I can't independently verify that, if you will. But when it moves on to justification, that's another topic. For instance, one theory of justification is called phenomenal conservatism. And phenomenal conservativists say that if it seems to you that P, as long as you don't have a defeater for P, you're justified in believing it to some extent. So if it just seems to me that God exists in the absence of a defeater, then I'm justified. But for warranted, because it's an externalist epistemology, that assumption needs to be made.
I see. Okay, please let me translate it, JB. Ya, jadi gimana kita memahami epistemologi reform dalam konteks Ibn Taimiyah tadi ya. Jadi sebenarnya bisa dibilang Jamie ini sedang menerjemahkan epistemologi reformnya Alvin Plantinga ke dalam konteks Islam ya. Jadi kalau di tadi ada beberapa hal yang disebut terkait dengan fitrah ya, akal sama ayat. FYI Jamie, in Indonesia mind is also called akal. So yeah, it's taken from
Arabic words, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So jadi ya teman-teman ya, fitrah, ayat sama akal. Ya. Jadi tiga hal tersebut adalah yang paling penting di dalam konteks epistemologi reform Islam. Ya. Jadi apabila Tuhan ada, gitu ya, dan juga apabila Islam itu benar, maka Tuhan akan menciptakan manusia sesuai dengan fitrahnya, gitu kan? Nah, kalau misalnya ia diciptakan sesuai dengan fitrahnya, ia akan punya suatu kemampuan untuk berpikir secara yang disebut sebagai akal, gitu ya. Nah, akal itu adalah sesuatu yang sebenarnya fakultas kognitif kalau bahasanya Plantinga, yang mana memproduksi pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan, gitu loh. Tapi nggak cuma karena itu doang, ya. Fakultas kognitif itu juga didukung sama entitas lainnya yang disebut sebagai ayat, ya, atau ayat kalau bahasa bahasa Arabnya gitu ya. Ayat itu adalah signs atau tanda-tanda daripada alam semesta, gitu ya. Ketika kita melihat langit, gitu ya, ketika melihat seorang ibu yang menggendong anaknya misalnya, gitu ya, itu bisa menjadi suatu hal yang memberikan kita imediasi, punya perasaan langsung, gitu. Oh, memang ada Tuhan ketika kita mempersepsi itu semua. Gitu loh. Nah, tapi tadi Jamie lanjutin ya, buat dia ayat ini juga bisa dipahami bukan cuma konteks alam semesta aja, tapi bahkan di dalam Quran itu sendiri. Jadi Quran itu memberikan seseorang atau seorang Islam itu pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan yang diproduksi sama akalnya. Gitu. Jadi kita dilahirkan sesuai dengan fitrah, diciptakan karena fitrah kita. Gitu ya, di dalam perspektif Ibn Taimiyah atau Islam, fitrah tersebut salah satunya adalah kemampuan akal, gitu ya, akal, gitu ya. Akal ketika mempersepsi ayat, gitu, entah yang ada di alam semesta atau yang ada di Al-Quran, itu punya perasaan imediasi atau kelangsungan terkait pengetahuan mengenai Tuhan. Nah, jadi itu kurang lebih kalau dalam perspektif Islam. Ini kan menarik juga nih buat teman-teman yang mungkin terasa relate. Jadi kalau ada pertanyaan silakan chat langsung, gitu ya. Okay, so it really is interesting, but I wonder how does we have some kind of immediacy when we see the signs around around the world, and even the Quran. But how does an Islamic Reform epistemologist respond to the pluralities of religious understanding? Like, there are so many religions. How do you think an Islamic Reform epistemologist explains the pluralities of religious understanding?
Yeah, very good question. I'm not entirely sure as to how we should approach this personally, because you see, within this debate among Reformed epistemologists, there are different views and there are different answers to this question. And this basically taps into another area in philosophy, which is essentially the epistemology of disagreement. So there is this idea that, you know, if you have an epistemic peer, someone who is roughly as virtuous as you, has the same level of intelligence as you, has the same evidence available to them, if they hold a belief contrary to your belief, then you should suspend judgment on what it is that you believe. Okay? But there are other views which say, no, that's not necessary to be rational. As long as you've done your homework, as long as you've looked at the evidence and the arguments and so on, if it just seems to you that this is the case, then you know, you're not being irrational in continuing to hold that belief. So this way of thinking has been applied in the context of Reformed epistemology. And Alvin Plantinga, he has a famous example. He said, his example is something like, imagine if you were a known thief, if you were known to steal things, perhaps, and you were accused of stealing an item from somebody's office, let's say, and you know, they had some evidence that it seemed like you were there, maybe an item of yours was left there in the office or something like that. And it seems if you go to court, the evidence stacks up against you, like the public objectable evidence available that can be seen to the public. It looks as though it's clear the evidence is against you. It's more probable from that perspective that you committed the crime. All right. But imagine you knew for a fact that you were not there that day, and you have this strong memory seeming that you were in a completely different place and you didn't do this at all. If that's the case, it seems even, you know, irrespective of these arguments produced by those in court, you are rational in continuing following your initial belief based on this strong seeming. Okay, so Plantinga said perhaps the same is the case for belief in God. Perhaps it's our seeming is so strong that even against these potential defeaters, we deflect those defeaters because of the strength of our seeming. And of course, that can be applied to Christian belief. It can be applied to Islamic belief as well. For me, that seems to some extent reasonable, but also to another extent not very satisfying. Another approach, of course, has just been to say, well, yeah, your belief in Islam or Christianity is initially basic and reasonable, properly basic, we can say. But when you get this defeater by this awareness of religious experience, you need to give not a positive argument to prove your religion, but a negative argument to prove that theirs is false, for instance. So that's another, you know, approach that you could take. And, you know, there are some approaches in between. For me, you know, as I said, I'm not really sure where I put myself, because I find the arguments on either side quite strong. and I'm still thinking over this question. There is another way that you could approach this, and I'll just leave this for now, and I'll let you translate. Another approach was proposed by a philosopher called Stephen Dijkstra, and he wrote a paper on what he called sensible evidentialism. And the idea for Dijkstra was that maybe belief in God can be properly basic for some people in an epistemic community, but within that community, there needs to be arguments, inferences, evidence available. So, for example, we believe in the existence of electrons, right? We believe in the existence of electrons, probably because your science teacher told you at school and you read it in a textbook. So you believe it on the basis of testimony, you believe it in a basic way, you didn't infer that belief, you just believe it when your teacher tells you. And that seems reasonable, but it's only reasonable because other scientists in that epistemic bubble or community have proven to some extent through inference, arguments, evidence that electrons exist. So there needs to be some in the epistemic community that have that sort of evidence or argument available, and for others, they can believe it in a basic way, but nonetheless, that evidence argument needs to be there. Perhaps some might think that the best approach for an Islamic account of Reformed epistemology is to think that we can believe in Islam in a basic way through testimony, but there needs to be evidence of a traditional kind available in the community. And Ibn Taymiyyah in other places seems to imply this potentially as well. But he also implies what I was saying as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll translate it, Jimmy. Ya, jadi pertanyaan saya tadi, memang dalam di dalam perspektif ini tadi ya, Epistemologi Reformed, Islam itu atau kepercayaan mengenai Tuhan dalam Islam itu adalah sesuatu yang immediate ya, secara langsung gitu ya, basic ya, dasariah gitu ya. Nah, pertanyaannya, kan agak-agak agama-agama lain nih, apakah berarti gimana nih kita cara untuk nentuin mana yang benar, kasarnya begitulah ya. Pertama-tama, kita nggak perlu memahami bahwa yang namanya disagreement atau pluralitas dalam kepercayaan beragama itu sebagai sebuah penghambat bagi kita untuk mempercayai dan juga melihat apa yang kita percayai sebagai sesuatu yang rasional, gitu ya. Ya sama lah ya, kayak misalnya saya tadi pakai contoh dari Alvin Plantinga, saya tiba-tiba dituduh sebagai seorang pencuri ya sama banyak orang, gitu ya. Tapi saya udah yakin banget nih ya, saya merasa bahwa enggak, saya ingat banget bahwa di waktu tersebut saya nggak lagi di tempat tersebut, tempat terjadinya pencurian itu. Nah, sekalipun orang-orang di sekitarmu percaya bahwa kamu salah, gitu, tapi kamu secara punya keyakinan yang teguh lah kasarnya gitu ya, bahwa enggak, saya nggak salah, gitu loh. Nah, itu kan nggak buat kepercayaan kamu jadi goyah harusnya. Ya kamu harusnya percaya sama apa yang kamu miliki tentang masa lalu dan juga memori kamu. Nah, itu pendekatan yang pertama, gitu ya. Pendekatan yang kedua, gitu ya, adalah pemahaman bahwa kita bisa menggunakan argumentasi ketika memang diperhadapkan sama diviter atau hal-hal yang berbeda terkait kepercayaan kita, gitu ya. Tapi argumennya bukan secara positif, gitu ya, bukan kita buktikan, gitu ya, bukan kayak argumentasi teologis, kalam dan sebagainya, tapi lebih negatif, kita menyanggah apa yang disampaikan kepada apa yang kita percayai. Gitu. Ada juga jalan tengahnya, itu dari Stephen Dijkstra, WYKSTRA, gitu, Dijkstra, gitu ya bacanya. Itu judulnya Evidentialisme Sensibel, gitu ya. Ini konteksnya lebih ke dalam yang komunitas, gitu ya. Jadi bagi seseorang supaya kepercayaannya terjamin ya, di dalam kondisi yang plural, itu adalah supaya komunitas epistemiknya itu punya bukti, gitu ya, sama seperti atom, quarks dan kawan-kawannya, gitu. Jadi bahkan ya di dalam kondisi plural, gitu ya, orang-orang beragama yang lain itu punya kepercayaan yang berbeda, itu nggak buat kepercayaanmu, ya, even di dalam Islam misalnya, itu jadi irasional. Jadi ini yang perlu di-highlight sih. Ya, yeah. So Jamie, I could say that one point that we need to highlight is that even if there's some kind of different beliefs in religion, it doesn't make your own belief in your religions something that need to be considered as irrational?
Yeah, well, I mean, this depends on your position on this idea of, within the epistemology of disagreement or religious disagreement. If you're somebody who thinks that when you acquire this awareness of religious diversity to some extent, if you continue to believe in a basic way, then you are irrational. Now, if you adopt that belief, then you would think that that person is being irrational. Now, one of the problems with this view, which is sometimes referred to as the equal weight view, which is the idea that you should give equal weight to your epistemic peers' view just as much as you give to your own view. The problem with that is it seems to look a little bit self-defeating, because some people don't accept the equal weight view. So if you have to give equal weight to your peers who don't accept the equal weight view, then it looks like you have to suspend judgment on believing the equal weight view, but it's through the equal weight view that you reach the conclusion that you did. So that looks problematic. So if you follow Plantinga and you think that as long as you have looked into, as long as you responded maybe to some defeaters, as long as even maybe if it just seems to you so strongly, as long as that's the case, then you could remain rational. I would like to suggest, though, that what's probably needed is some awareness of some response in some sense to the defeater from religious diversity. So I am thinking along the lines of Dijkstra or something like that. Not entirely, but I think that you might need to respond to some of these defeaters, potentially. But I think anyway, we should just say to those listening that Reformed epistemology is the view, of course, that religious belief can be rational apart from argument, but it still thinks that you should respond to defeaters if you acquire them. So if you acquire a defeater, you have to respond to that in some sense. But as I say, I'm not really sure as to the correct answer at the moment. I am doing some research on this and probably can share it with you later, another time.
Okay, thank you. Please let me translate it. Jadi kan tadi saya nanya ya, apakah berarti gini kan poinnya bahwa oke, nggak apa-apa kok orang-orang lain mungkin nggak percaya sama apa yang saya percaya, tapi saya yakin sama hal itu. Jadi orang lain salah, kasar begitu kan. Nah, itu agak problematis. Kenapa? Karena kita kan perlu secara seimbang gitu ya, untuk menimbang, loh kenapa nggak mereka juga rasional? Kita kan perlu sama-sama lah ya, nggak boleh yang kita lebih menilai kita punya lebih baik. Nah, itu akan menjadi sedikit permasalahan gitu ya. Karena pada akhirnya ya perlu satu tindakan lainnya selain pendekatnya secara secara mendasar gitu ya, atau secara langsung. Nah, bagaimana tuh? Tadi Jamie percaya bahwa ya itu ya, yang dari Dijkstra tadi itu cukup kecenderungan untuk percaya di Dijkstra tersebut, bahwa kita pada akhirnya memang harus merespon terhadap sanggahan atau argumen against atau terhadap apa yang kita percaya gitu loh. Jadi Epistemologi Reformed itu percaya bahwa kita bisa tahu mengenai Tuhan tanpa argumen, tanpa bukti, tapi kita tetap harus merespon terhadap apabila ada yang namanya argumen yang menyanggah apa yang kita percaya, gitu loh. Jadi kurang lebih begitu soal Epistemologi Reformed. Nah, kalau misalnya teman-teman ada pertanyaan, silakan boleh chat, entah secara personal atau chat kepada saya. Jadi ini saya akan jawab dulu nih. Ada pertanyaan yang lucu ya. Hello, so Jamie, can we go to the questions from some of the participants? Yeah, there's someone who chat on public and someone who chat to me personally. I think it's quite interesting person. Hello, may I ask, are both speakers Reformed? So, Jamie, are you a Reformed?
No, I'm not. No, obviously, to be Reformed, you have to be Christian anyway. So, I'm Muslim, so I can't call myself Reformed, I'm afraid. What about you, Samuel?
I won't call myself. I was Reformed, but I don't know. I don't even call myself an evangelical. I think it's I'm still thinking about it, but I couldn't say I'm a reform anyway. Yeah, but I have interest in reform epistemology. And the next questions it related to the reform. What actually is the reform in reform epistemology, Jamie?
Yeah, good question. I think Plantinga and others, they regret the fact that Reformed epistemology is called Reformed epistemology. It just seems like a bad name for this view because, recent epistemologists have shown that actually the idea of Reformed epistemology is compatible with numerous theories of justification in mainstream epistemology. So the fact that it's got this link to the Reformed theological tradition in Christianity just seems misleading. Like, how can you have an Islamic account of Reformed Christian theology? It doesn't make sense. Of course, the view, as I've said many times, is just that religious belief can be rational, apart from arguments. So the idea of Reformed comes from the fact that Plantinga and others were inspired by John Calvin, the famous Reformed theologian. John Calvin taught that human beings have been created with a sensus divinitatis, and when the sensus divinitatis functions accordingly, belief in God can be known apart from argumentation. So it gets its name from Calvin's inspiration on Plantinga's work. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Please let me translate it. Jadi nama reform ini dari mana sih sebenarnya? Epistemologi Reform. Tadi Jamie bilang bahwa Plantinga ini agak nyesel gitu ya. Kenapa dia namain reform? Karena kesannya itu sangat eksklusif gitu ya. Yang boleh pakai epistemologi reform cuma orang-orang reform gitu. Cuma orang yang punya perspektif tertentu mengenai teologi Kristen. Tapi sebenarnya enggak ya, nama reform itu sekedar karena dia terinspirasi sama John Calvin, salah seorang reformator asal Swiss gitu ya, yang bicara soal sensus divinitatis atau sense of divinity. Tapi anyway, sebenarnya reform epistemologi ini Jamie bilang sesederhana, kalian nggak perlu argumen untuk punya kepercayaan yang terjamin mengenai Tuhan gitu. Jadi reform ini cuma karena mereka terinspirasi aja, tapi nggak karena teologi reform gitu. Jamie, one more questions. So did Ibn Taymiyah also think about the contradictions of reason and tradition? Yeah, it's about Ibn Taymiyah, but I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So basically, Ibn Taymiyyah, he wrote a very famous treatise or work, which is nowadays in print in 10 volumes, 10 different books, which is roughly translated as averting the conflict between reason and revelation. And I'm glad that this question was asked, because Ibn Taymiyyah, he's sometimes been portrayed wrongly as this kind of irrational theologian who's anti-logic and anti-reason, and he's not a rational thinker. But that's really not the case. And also, when you look at Ibn Taymiyyah's work, he tries to give arguments as to how reason and revelation are harmonious, and he sees reason as underpinning the revelation itself. In other words, to accept revelation is also to follow the dictates of reason. And Ibn Taymiyyah, he also suggests that those whose fitrah has become corrupted, they may need arguments to restore it, or to believe rationally, we might say in contemporary terms. And so he also thought that Islam and God can be proved through rational arguments. So he wasn't against arguments. And Plantinga is similar, of course. Plantinga, he thinks that arguments can help one's belief achieve warrant for those who, for instance, have a corrupt sensus divinitatis, we might say. So yeah, Ibn Taymiyyah, unlike what many think of him, was a theologian that promoted the use of reason and argumentation, despite believing we can also know in a fitri or innate immediate sense as well.
To be honest, I know Ibn Taymiyyah first from your writing. I never heard him before. But I think he's a great and interesting thinker, Jimmy.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, he's not one of the most famous thinkers like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd or Avicenna, Averroes, because they have a place in the Western tradition. You know, for instance, Thomas Aquinas drew on those the ideas of those philosophers, so they're well known in European and well across the world. Ibn Taymiyyah is usually known for his work in jurisprudence or Islamic law, more so than philosophy and theology. But he was also a theologian and philosopher. And now people in the West, in the English-speaking world and in Germany and in France, they are bringing his ideas to the forefront more and more over several decades. So that's really exciting to see what will come of it.
Okay, please let me translate it. Jadi Ibn Taymiyah itu nulis 10 buku ya teman-teman, 10 volume buku tentang hubungan antara wahyu sama nalar ya atau akal gitu. Itu 10 volume ya, tebel banget gitu ya, bukan sama kayak Summa Teologianya Aquinas, bahkan lebih kali ya gitu. Jadi Ibn Taymiyah ini pemikir yang seringkali dicap negatif ya, kalau dia tuh irasional dan segala macam. Tapi itu salah gitu ya. Dia percaya bahwa soal Tuhan itu juga bisa dibicarakan secara rasional, dan bahkan kamu mungkin punya argumen loh secara rasional untuk ngomongin soal Tuhan. Jadi bukan yang ya bisa dibilang bukan seorang fideis gitu kali ya kalau zaman sekarang bahasanya. Dia percaya itu secara rasional. Dan memang dia ini nggak punya tempat seperti Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina ya atau Al-Ghazali. Dia nggak kalau di Barat kan cukup dikenal gitu ya. Tapi kalau kalau si siapa namanya Ibn Taymiyah ini di Barat nggak terlalu dikenal, gitu, nggak ada tempatnya. Cuma baru belakangan ini para pemikir dari Prancis, Jerman itu mulai mendekati dan membicarakan soal Ibn Taymiyah. Menarik sih ya. Okay, one more questions, Jamie. Is it okay? Interesting questions. If someone's born from an atheistic perspective, if someone's born from an atheist parents and they are taught by atheistic values, what happened with cognitive? What happened with the cognitive, the cognitive faculty? Will human could turn off the cognitive faculty?
Yeah, sorry, your connection just went. Okay, yeah. So basically, if an atheist, is grown up in obviously an atheistic community, what's the problem with them? In what sense are they not functioning properly? Well, of course, the idea of fitra in the Islamic tradition, or the idea of sensus divinitatis maybe in the Christian tradition, it's not necessarily a cognitive faculty in any ordinary sense. It's not a faculty like my eyes, for instance, as being a faculty of sight. It's a faculty that's, designed by God specifically for theistic belief. And so it seems that, if God exists and God wants us to know him, which we would think so if God exists and God wants us to know him, then God wants us to enter into a relationship with him. And in order to enter into a relationship with him, we need to acquire the right values, the right set of moral beliefs, beliefs about being willing to follow him, being sincere to God, etc. And also avoiding what is against the good, i.e. avoiding sin. And so it seems that in order to have this proper relationship with God, there needs to be some kind of preparatory spiritual work in place. And perhaps these environments, these atheistic environments, they prevent the individual in question from having the right prerequisite kind of spiritual training that is required before belief in God is actualized. So that's one way I think of putting it. There's also a recent article that was published by I can't remember his name. I think he's called Hamid Wahid. He's an Iranian philosopher. He just published a book, an article in Faith and Philosophy called the noetic effects of sin. And he goes into how sin can, in some sense, damage our possibility of knowledge, etc. And so I would recommend that article if you want to explore that question in more depth. But that's maybe a kind of a simple answer for now.
Yeah, maybe it's like what Plantinga said about cognitive environment. Am I right?
Exactly.
Could we say?
Yeah. Yeah, you need to be in the right cognitive environment. Exactly.
Okay, please let me translate it, Jim. Jadi bisa nggak ya tadi ya orang dididik secara ateis, fakultas kognitifnya rusak. Tanda kutip bisa ya. Perlu suatu latihan yang prerequisite training gitu, untuk seseorang punya kemampuan untuk bisa tahu atau percaya mengenai Tuhan gitu. Jadi memang lingkungan kognitif seseorang itu sangat mempengaruhi juga bagaimana fakultas kognitifnya bekerja gitu. Makanya ada tadi salah satu hal yang someone's name Nurkolis Majid, one of a big thinker in Indonesia who write about Ibn Taymiyah.
Yes, I know him, and also I have that PhD dissertation on my laptop right now. I've read it, and I would definitely recommend that. Also, it was never published, but if you want, Samuel, if nobody has it, I can send it to you. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I'll send you email later. So yeah. So Jamie, I think that's the questions. It's already 11 past 15 here in Indonesia, and there are still around 30 participants. So yeah, I could say we should appreciate the participants who stayed until around midnight here in Indonesia.
Of course, it's very kind of them and you, and I'm really grateful that you contacted me and asked me to discuss with you. It's really an honor. Also, I have a few forthcoming works. I have some on Ibn Taymiyyah, Islam and Science. I have also a response to an article which was called an epistemic defeater for Islamic belief. I have a response to that. I also have a forthcoming book chapter which is entitled Ibn Taymiyyah's Common Sense Philosophy, which draws closer links between Plantingian thought than my current paper. So perhaps in the future we can discuss these if you like. But it's been a pleasure. And also,
please.
I would like to congratulate you on your remarkable translation skills and the fact that you can remember everything that I've said. I don't know how you do it, because even I can't remember it.
I think it's habituations. It's around there's a dozen speakers. Maybe it's habituations. Thank you. We're really grateful to have you here. We really want to have another opportunities to have you here. Maybe I'll follow your works on your ResearchGate or on your Facebook. We're really waiting for your another published works.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, take care.
Thank you, Jimmy. See you later.
Thank you. See you later. Bye-bye.